Mr. Liddy, boy, I've got a couple of ones that I know are sort of like you've heard before, but what I wanted to say first was please consider taking this $400+ million in bonuses, breaking it down, not necessarily just for one member, but for the public, into those people who were generating EBIT in sections of the company that are providing positive cash flow and positive EBIT. And let people understand that these are performers who are delivering real value, who should be rewarded because you need that profit as part of your going concern. And then whatever's left, we can argue about. But I'm hoping for the sake of all of us on the dais and for the public, we make it very clear that even in a company that's having bad times, even when a car dealership is only selling 12 cars, you still pay a commission to the guy that sold 11 of them. Okay, and you pay a bonus to the guy that sold 11 out of the 12 cars.
Exactly right.
So to the extent that you have those individuals, whatever percentage, whatever dollars, I think those performers, maybe not by name but by category, should be identified so the American people don't see a big number and assume that this was all just a giveaway. I spent too long in business to not appreciate your problem of keeping good people that can keep the ship afloat, particularly the ones that are producing in divisions that are producing. I want to get to one closing set of questions, though. Your predecessor, I guess 2 ago, Mr. Greenberg, when he came to us, he not only told us that you should have filed bankruptcy, but he basically led me to believe that you had an obligation to file bankruptcy. The Treasury had an obligation. Everyone had an obligation. When you stopped being when you had a going concern opinion, you stopped working for the stockholders and you start working for the secured creditors. That's just a reality of your board, that as a viable going concern, you maximize stockholder value. As soon as you are not a going concern, you have to look to your in-order preferred creditors, secured creditors, and you have an obligation to them. Mr. Greenberg led us to believe, and I've checked with bankruptcy experts, and it appears he's right, that tens of billions of dollars were paid out that had your firm filed bankruptcy would not have been paid because the corpus that was bankrupt was firewalled from other parts of the company. Therefore, yes, FP would have gone bankrupt. It would have delivered whatever assets it had. Other claims against the company, to the extent they existed, would have been cleared in bankruptcy. But huge parts, some of the very companies you're talking about that have large value, would have been firewalled from that. How do you respond to that?
I think the regulators in those 130 countries that we do business would have grabbed those insurance assets and would have held on to them and wouldn't have released them to anybody, and there would have been a very substantial debate internationally about who owned and who controlled those assets.
So what you're saying is you couldn't count on the rule of law, so that's why the Treasury ordered you to pay monies to people like Goldman Sachs, who you paid with dollars that were put into the corpse and paid out of the corpse in excess of any kind of value that it had, but are burdened to the parent company around what otherwise would have been a firewall.
Well, once a decision was made not to declare bankruptcy, that sets in motion a whole series of events. You have to honor the contracts. The Federal Reserve decided that we should pay 100 cents on the dollar, that 100 cents on the dollar should be paid in the settlement of those various...
Right, but these were credit default swaps that I could have bought for a fraction of that on an open market to the extent that somebody was floating them at the time, right? So we paid more than their current value at the time we paid them off.
I believe that's what the Federal Reserve decided was in the best interest of the financial system.
So the Federal Reserve paid a premium. I just want to make sure we have it because we have 3 trustees we're entrusting with our money going forward. The Federal Reserve paid a known premium, and they paid it not to FP, so that we're all talking about FP, where they paid it to the parent company and caused you to take onto your balance sheet and your stockholders to be diluted based on a decision the Treasury made for you not to file bankruptcy and, in fact, for you to go down their way. And as you said, they made the decision. You got your instructions from the Fed and Treasury. That's what you've said here, right?
Well, the Federal Reserve, it's not just getting instructions. The Federal Reserve handled those discussions and negotiations to settle those counterparties.
So the question I'm going to be asking the trustees going forward, because they're in a similar situation, but a little different than you, your board and you had an independent responsibility to your stockholders, the now 20%, used to be 100%, and to other creditors that when the decision was made outside of your company not to go into bankruptcy, and the decision was made to take all of the assets otherwise not encumbered in a normal firewalled situation and put them in, your company today, whatever it's worth, owes this money to the Treasury, to the American people, but it owes it based on decisions that were made that were not prudent on their face for your company. May have been prudent for the world, may have been prudent for the financial markets, but they weren't prudent for your company in the ordinary course of you get to make the decision.
Well, Congressman, it could turn out that they were very prudent. It's all a matter of whether, at the end of this whole situation, we're able to pay back the American public all the money that's been either loaned to or invested in AIG.
But I just asked you what your enterprise value was worth in the last round.
Right.
And I asked you so you'd have an opportunity to take the $35 billion here, the $40 billion here, and say these enterprises, after we get into a good situation, are worth X amount, offsetting, 100% of the debt potentially, and returning, because a year and a half ago, you could have been worth $100 billion for your stock price. I agree that our investment of $40 to $70 billion at the height of your stock in the last 2 years would have been whole. My question to you, though, was, and I'd like you to answer for the record, is break down what you believe the enterprise value is today. Mr. Kashkari, when he was before this committee, told us he didn't know what he paid for things and he didn't know what they were worth and he couldn't answer it, but he'd give us a report in 30 days. He resigned in roughly 29 days, apparently, so he's not back. Please do not think you're not going to be back before us if you can't answer what you believe today the enterprise value is, so that given a static economy, not pie in the sky and not future earnings, but the real value of your enterprise, what it's worth. What have the American people bought for $190 billion?
The assets minus the liabilities, including all the money that we owe, either to the Federal Reserve or to TARP, that number is what's left over, and that's what's represented in that 2.7 billion shares at $1.85 or so a share. But that's after you settle all of the obligations.
So your answer today is we're completely solvent, other than our $40 billion has become 70% of $4 billion. That's where we are. That's the answer you're giving me here today when you answer that way, is that assets and liabilities balance in the enterprise value. What's left is the hypothetical market that the market is saying, which is $4 billion, and that's $40 billion of our money and the rest of the stockholders. So that says we have a loss in your statement of that delta, call it $38 billion. If that's what you believe, fine, but that's what the market is marking your stock for. What I asked you for was your real belief of your enterprises, individual enterprises' value. You can normalize them for multiples of EBIT, what their PEs would be in an ordinary market, what their PEs would be on a separate company basis. You know all the ways to value it. I just think this committee should have an understanding of today what you believe the enterprise which you're running and the trustees are overseeing is worth, in a way that we can have some understanding of why you think you'll pay us back over and above what you gave us here today. And I appreciate the fact that the stock is whatever it is on a given day. What I want to know, and I think the Chairman and I both want to know, is just how you value these assets normalized. We understand you may not realize them for 2 years, but we have been asking for those kinds of numbers since previous president and previous everybody in this cycle.
And I'll just take one more crack at it. Those assets, if you take the assets that I just talked about earlier and added them all up, they'll add up to whatever, $80 or $90 billion. I can't do the math that fast. And that should be enough to satisfy the $83 billion that we actually owe to either the Federal Reserve or the United States Treasury now. To the extent we have to use more of the $30 billion, we hope that we'll be able to recover that value by having even higher asset values, because we plug an asset hole or what have you. So the asset values should be sufficient to satisfy what all of the obligations of the company are, and keep the taxpayer whole. If the marketplace stays strong, that leaves only the stub residual value, which right now is that $5 or $6 billion, and hopefully this all works out well, and that's worth more and more.